It is his dream to be alone. I earn a living by giving poetry readings, and about a week a month. And one wonderful thing about poetry readings is that it's made clear to everybody, I think, that though poetry is written alone, not for yourself, but it's written in solitude, a poetry reading makes clear that the poem only lives in a community. All right, I'm going to begin, I think, with a poem called Snowbanks North of the House. And it's a poem about the kind of resistance that often appears inside of us and suddenly tries to block whatever we want to do. In Minnesota, you often notice the snowbanks coming up to the north side of the house, but not quite. Those great sweeps of snow that stop suddenly 6 feet from the house. Thoughts that go so far. The boy gets out of high school and reads no more books. The son stops calling home. The mother puts down her rolling pin and makes no more bread. The wife looks at her husband one night at a party and loves him no more. The energy leaves the wine, and the minister falls, leaving the church. It will not come closer. The one inside moves back, and the hands touch nothing and are safe. And the father grieves for his son and will not leave the room where the coffin stands. He turns away from his wife, and she sleeps alone. And the sea lifts and falls all night. And the moon goes on through the unattached heavens alone. And the toe of the shoe pivots in the dust. And the man in the black coat turns and goes back down the hill. No one knows why he came or why he turned away and did not climb the hill. That's a kind of an introductory poem. Good and sad for you.
Robert Bly, the poet, works alone. And like so many poets, he needs to work alone, reading and writing as he often does, at his lakeside cabin in northern Minnesota. The results of his work, his poetry and translations of other poets, have made him one of America's most versatile and lively writers, yet few of us have heard of him. Poets in older cultures, biblical prophets, classical writers, or tribal shamans who spoke to their peoples in stories, songs, and spells, these poets were more of a part of everyday life. But the voice of the poet in America today seems lost, hidden among the many voices of experts and officials, newsreaders and commentators, preachers and politicians. Poets are perhaps almost invisible among us, seen only occasionally, and only by a few. Bly's readings, like this one at the old Muskego Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, continue to restore some of the traditional energy of the poet's role.
I suppose around 1962, it began to be apparent that there was a terrific darkness in this country. I first noticed it driving into Madison and seeing huge piles of used tires. I don't know why it was so depressing, but it was apparent we were going down into some kind of despair and suffering. And I wrote this little poem. Come with me into those things that have felt this despair for so long, those removed Chevrolet wheels that howl with a terrible loneliness, lying on their backs in the cindery dirt like men drunk and naked or staggering off down a hill to drown at last in a pond. Or those shredded inner tubes abandoned on the shoulders of throughways, black and collapsed bodies that tried and burst and were left behind. And those curly steel shavings scattered around on garage benches, sometimes still warm, gritty when we hold them, who have given up and blame everything on the government. And those roads in South Dakota that feel around in the darkness. You notice a little fear in the last line? Every time I get to South Dakota or North Dakota, I get terrified. And I turn around and come back instantly. And strangely enough, that's the way people from Ohio feel when they get to Minnesota. But I feel Minnesota is quite warm and comfortable. It's North Dakota and South Dakota that bug me.
As a poet, editor, and translator, Bly became more visible than most poets in America during the time of the Vietnam War. It was then that he organized a series of readings against the war, readings which did a great deal to focus the protests of other poets and provide them with a forum for speaking out against American action in Southeast Asia. Bly's second collection of poems, The Light Around the Body, received the National Book Award for Poetry in 1967. In this book, the force of his moral anger against the war put the personal landscapes of his earlier work into a new and darker context. At the award ceremony in New York, Bly handed over his check to a young man representing the anti-war movement. At least half the people present booed the action.
And this is a poem I wrote driving towards Duluth with my wife. I don't think any children were there at this time. And it was the time when we just bombed Hanoi for the first time. And it was absolutely amazing to me to be driving, I think we were driving around Paynesville, and you saw those incredible turkey farms, which they take such good care of those turkeys. And how much care they have for them. And suddenly, evidently, you know, the people in Vietnam are not up to the level of the turkeys or something. There was that terrific contrast between the carefully manicured and cared for Minnesota countryside and what was actually going on. And I don't mean to say that I solve it in any way. I just want to keep that contrast going in the poem. Driving through Minnesota during the Hanoi bombings. We drive between lakes just turning green. Late June. The white turkeys have been moved to new grass. How long the seconds are in great pain. Terror just before death. Shoulders torn, shot from helicopters. The boy tortured with a telephone generator. I felt sorry for him and blew his head off with a shotgun. These instants become crystals, particles. The grass cannot dissolve. Our own gaiety will end up in Asia. And you will look down into your coffee cup and see black starfighters. We were the ones we intended to bomb. Therefore, we will have to go far away to atone for the suffering of the stringy-chested and the small rice-fed ones, quivering in the helicopter like wild animals, shot in the chest, taken back to be questioned. So I think the kind of blaming that went on during the time of the war is gone now. I don't say the blaming was wrong, but it's gone. It's been replaced by a kind of general grief, I think, on the part of everyone, even the generals. And we deserved it, and we got it. It's also called a depression. The unconscious knows what it's doing.
Robert Bly served in a war of his own. After high school, he left the family farm in southwestern Minnesota to enlist in the Navy. There, tests showed that he had an unusually high aptitude for math, and he was put into a training program to become a radar specialist. And it was in the Navy that he heard the first poem that moved him to write, a description of the slums of Chicago written by a Navy chum. After being discharged, he went home for a while and then left for college. First St. Olaf's in Northfield, Minnesota, then Harvard.
I don't know, I can't explain it. And I feel myself partly, when I was in college, I tried to write poetry out of what I was taught, which was John Donne, John Milton, a few other Englishmen, and it did not work. I tried. I sat up in northern Minnesota for a while, up in a little cabin up there that we found up there, and I shot a partridge every night illegally to eat, and then I was trying to write Miltonic sonnets. A kid wandering in the woods with an illegal rifle and snowshoes trying to write Miltonic sonnets. And if any good man had been there, he could have committed me for that. And later, it was when I read Pablo Neruda that, the first lines I read of Neruda were in Oslo, where I went to try to get to feel some of my relatives. Actually, I told the government I was going to translate Norwegian poetry, which I eventually did. But and I got over there, and I found Neruda in the public library there. And one of the lines I saw, young girls with their hands on their hearts, dreaming of pirates. And I said, wow, that is something. That's much better than Tennyson, I'll tell you.
When he graduated, he rejected a fellowship that would have kept him 4 more years at Harvard. After another short time at home, he set out, like many young artists, for New York City. There, he tried to write poetry. What Bly left behind in Minnesota was a family farm run by his Norwegian-American parents. His father had done well during the war and bought 3 neighboring farms for his sons. But one day, when Robert was 7, his grandmother said to his father, "Robert will not be a farmer." Here, at a lodge in northern Minnesota, where Bly is fond of visiting with friends, he talks about his family and his attempts to start as a young writer.
Let's say, put it this way, that society wants you to succeed. I get out of college, I don't go anywhere. I go to New York and I live alone, right? My friends go off to Oxford or something like that. From their point of view, I don't do anything. From my mother's point of view, I don't do anything. From my father's point of view, I'm a flop. From the point of view of all my friends in high school, I'm a flop. So therefore, you feel this pressure all the time at that age. A young male and a young female does to do. The young female is supposed to get married, the young man is supposed to have a book. And suppose that you don't, then you begin, if you feel the pressure coming down on you, you begin to get desperate. That's what I'm talking about. And then at a certain point, when I thought, well, I never will succeed, and I never will please, I'll just live in New York forever, with my pants patched 5 times in the same place. And I got along, I scrounged as best I could. I had usually 1 meal a day at the automat at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Beef pie, 32 cents, and wonderful. And I had a Chesterfield overcoat, which I still have, which I'd bought for 50 cents in a used place. And I looked very elegant coming in from my VPI. And then I worked as a file clerk 1 day a week or so, and I worked as a typist. And then for a while, I also worked as a painter. I went down to an employment office, and I told this man that I wanted a job painting. And he said, fine, Helena Rubinstein just called up today, and she wants one of her basements painted down on 32nd Street, you know, one of her shops. And he said, what experience do you have? And I put down painting barns. and he said, I don't think we'll put that in. and so he sent me there with the crew. And what happened was that they sent me down to paint this basement, and they had big beams like this running along. There were heating pipes, you know, metal. And I had my new painter's outfit I just bought that day, my new little bag, you know, and everything. And they gave me the brush, and they gave me this funny rag. I didn't know what that was. And there was 5 or 6, and they all had their trousers covered with paint, you know. Mine was new. I was one down, you know. And I was nervous. And so he said, okay, as the guy, he said, okay, boys, up there, start on the things up there. So I get up with my brush, you know, and there's about this much dust on top of there, you know, but I get my brush, I'm going like this, you know. And I'm up there about 5 minutes, and this man says, okay, Bob, come down, Bob. And I come down, and he says, oh, I'm sorry, Bob, you're fired to go, you know. And I said, what did I do wrong? He said, well, what do you think I gave you the rag for Christ's sake? You brush all that stuff off first, and then you paint it. Oh, wow. So by 9:20, I was back in the employment agency. And the man was very sweet, and he said, I knew you'd come back. He said that boss is a tough one, and he fires a lot of people. He said, but that's all right. You get fired 3 or 4 times. You'll learn how. He said, you want to try again tomorrow morning? I said, sure. I was bruised, you know, weeping. Anyway, so and then I could easily live for 6 days on what I made that one day.
But in New York, Bly found his favorite room in the world, as he calls it, the reading room at the New York Public Library. There he first read the great 13th century Italian poet Dante, and it was during this time that he began to develop an interest in what Carl Jung calls the feeling or submerged feminine side of a man's personality.
These Norwegian Lutheran churches are very touching, and this one is amazing. But they are not very, the feminine is a little absent. And I realized when I was about 24 or so, trying to write poems, that I had no idea of the feminine in myself. I hadn't met her. So I wrote a poem called A Man Writes to a Part of Himself. What cave are you in, hiding, rained on, like a wife, starving, without care, water dripping from your head, bent over ground corn? You raise your face into the rain that drives over the valley. Forgive me, your husband, on the streets of a distant city laughing, with many appointments, though at night going also to a bare room of poverty, to sleep beside a bare pitcher in a basin in a room with no heat. Which of us two then is the worse off? And how did this separation come about? Which of us two then is the worse off? And how did this separation come about? So I remember it, even physically, the sense in your 20s, when a male does not have his feminine side developed at all, of going into a room and how barren and cold that room is, and how empty it seems, and how you want to leave it. I had a sense of where I could go then. I had a sense not of what I was. In ancient astrology, they always taught, you know, astrology now tells you what you are. You're an Aquarius, you like music, you know, and that stuff like that. But in ancient astrology, they taught you where you weren't. So therefore, I knew I was a male. I knew I had some brains. I knew I had some talent. It was totally worthless. I didn't know where I was going. So by realizing that I literally, I mean, the images that are here are rather primitive, and my wife is in a cave somewhere or in the valley. I am in the city. I didn't intend it that way. I just noticed it after I wrote it, which means that there's not only I'm separated from the feminine side, but what's more, I'm in an industrial place, a city, and she's still out. Wow. And that's perfect. Later, I read in Jung, he says, if you do not work or love any part of yourself, it gradually becomes primitive. I've spent a lot of time recently, not time, but thinking, trying to separate the ideas of St. Paul from those of Christ. And it's something I think the church is failing to do. I find a fantastic distinction between the ideas, especially in the area of the feminine. Christ again and again makes it clear that the feminine in him is fully accepted and the feminine in women. And he does that by making sure you understand that Mary is with him, that Mary Magdalene is there, that he does not stone the woman caught in adultery. And those are very powerful statements which even St. Paul was unable to remove. St. Paul then comes along with the typical Judaic anti-female propaganda and lays it on all of us. So I don't want to get into a theological argument, though it is fun in a church like this. And when I go with the Catholics and I tease them, you know, and I can't do that as well as I can tease the Lutherans, but I think it's very important. We're coming to the point in our culture when we are beginning for the first time to recognize that a lot of our disasters come from the male's refusing to recognize a woman inside, and therefore also connected the woman not respecting and loving herself, but having a lot of distrust of herself inside. That's all the way through the culture and all the way through Christianity. And what is so touching to me is not to see it in Christ's remarks. So it's time, I think, for the church to begin to make that distinction. So therefore, I started this by saying many young people are turning away from the church precisely because modern psychological things indicate to them that St. Paul is simply a neurotic. Besides, he's a saint, of course, but he's also a neurotic, and a very deep sexual neurotic. So therefore, if you read St. Paul once, the first thing you say is you call up Freud on the telephone. You say, you got an hour next week, because we have someone here. Well, and we have to be able to look at our text in this way. We can't pretend that that Freud and Jung have never existed. We can't pretend that we're living in 100 AD, in which we're going to swallow everything that a church convention in 400 AD put in as a holy text. We're just sheep if we do that. Well, I didn't mean to get into a sermon here, but I'm serious that it's time for us to have a convention in which we remove the books of St. Paul and we put in a lot of the great spiritual work that has been done since St. Paul. Rainer Maria Rilke's poems belong in the New Testament, many of them. Dante, work of Dante belongs in the New Testament. Meister Eckhart belongs in the New Testament. There's no reason we shouldn't do that. The text has to be renewed.
After 3 years in New York, Bly came back to Minnesota, back to make contact with the earth, with the land where he was raised, and to go north to the lakes and woods where he used to vacation as a young boy. Now he began to write poems that pleased him more, poems closer to his life as he was trying to live it.
If it's true that the feeling lies on the feminine side, then a certain number of your own feelings become open to you. And isn't that what poetry is written with? And if the male side develops wrong in a man or a woman, they end up in the Moon Palace. Moon Palace is a long ways up there. It's cold, and it deals with reflected light, And in the Moon Palace, you live the provisional life. Understand? You don't mean this poem, you mean the next one. You don't love this woman, but the next one. Nothing seems real in the Moon Palace. And I lived there for years and years. And so therefore someone said to me, how do you come down out of the Moon Palace? And I said, diapers are a great help. And I'm serious. You know, that part, taking care of children and all of those things like that, feeding children and caring for them, is a great help in bringing the male down from his Moon Palace. Well, sit down. What happened is that I cut off the ends with a saw, as you suggested. Now, will you paint the ends of those?
I guess so.
Soon after he was married, when he was 36, he published his first book of poems, Silence in the Snowy Fields. This was in 1962. In the years since then, he's worked hard, publishing a wide range of poems, essays, anthologies, and translations. The work of many poets and writers in America has been touched by his energy.
How does that feel?
He now has 4 children of his own. His time is divided between travel around the country, giving poetry readings and lectures, his cabin by the lake up north, and the farm. There he takes care of a few animals and does some odd jobs. His nephew does the main work of farming the 160 acres. Boys love to be on the track and let me go. There's a little one I should read you if I haven't read it. Maybe I read it. I don't know if I read this one. Thinking of seclusion, but the family. After 2 food. I get up late and ask what has to be done today. Nothing has to be done, so the farm looks doubly good. The blowing maple leaves fit so well with the moving grass. The shadow of my writing shack looks small beside the growing trees. Never be with your children. Let them get stringy like radishes. Let your wife worry about the lack of money. Your whole life is like some drunkard's dream. You haven't combed your hair for a whole month. And there is always the problem when you're writing, and that is the amount of solitude that you need. And if you have children, it's very difficult to know how to divide your time. And you can never do it right. But I've been always very interested that the Chinese poets talked about that a lot. And the poem that I read is adapted from that, from an old Chinese poet. Never be with your children. Let them get stringy like radishes. Let your wife worry about the lack of money. And if you don't have a salary, you know, someone worries about the lack of money. Let your wife worry about the lack of money. That's a heavy line. Your whole life is like some drunkard's dream. And that doesn't mean that the poet is like Dylan Thomas and drinks. It means that drunkards apparently have, really strange dreams in China, and they think they're a butterfly or something. Your whole life is like some drunkard's dream. You haven't combed your hair for a whole month.
it once more now. A little harder. Now, wait a minute, don't hit my head. Hit it back. Go! Ah!
You made it, Father.
Ah.
You're too hard.
You hit it with your wind. You're too windy.
As a young writer, Bly looked to older poets for help. Walt Whitman and William Butler Yeats, whom he continues to read every day. He believes that a young writer must find a guide and a friend in some older person.
Down. Good. Okay, I think that's done. For males, we're just talking about males. That's all I know anything about. The process of growing for a male, let's say, involves finding an older male to help you. And I was thinking about it today in terms of Jack and the Beanstalk. The first thing that happens in Jack and the Beanstalk that's important is that he disobeys his mother. She says, sell the cow for money. If he does that, he's in the economic system. So the best thing that he does is to disobey his mother, and he goes out and he sells the cow for a couple of beans, a couple of weird beans. But who does he get those beans from? He gets them from an old man. So what is invisible in that story is the fact that he's met the older male who will guide him. And the older male who will guide him taught him that if you sell a cow's very important, but you don't have to accept the usual society view of it and get money for it. Maybe a couple magic beans would be a good price for a cow. And the male has to be able to accept the weird ideas of an old man before his growth starts. You want one chanted? I'll give you a Yeats poem chanted. How many years ago were you and I unlettered lads, mad as the mist and the snow? You ask me, what makes me sigh, old friend? What makes me shudder so? I shudder and I sigh to think that even Cicero and many-minded Homer were mad as the mist and the snow. Isn't that wonderful? Is it? He's 70 years old, he writes that thing.
The town where he was born, Madison, Minnesota, and the landscape around have always been important to Bly. Like many small towns, Madison is a community centered around farming, and Bly feels more comfortable in this atmosphere than in a university setting, more at ease among silos than ivory towers. It's not usual for a small town to have a poet in residence, and Bly manages to handle his notoriety with a bit of humor.
But the whole issue is funny. The other day, Mary, I think, came home and said, Daddy, you should hear the terrible things they say about you in high school. And I said, really? What do they say? Well, one boy says that your poetry is, they said, his poetry is so bad he has to sell it by the bushel. And I said, what does that mean, Mary? She said, I don't know, but he's been saying it since the 7th grade. Your poetry is so bad you have to sell it by the bushelful. And I said, wow, that's a wonderful idea, selling poetry by the bushel. So I must say that in general, you don't feel that I don't feel that the town has changed in any way by my living near it. But after all, why should it be? On the other hand, I don't feel that heavy anger and antagonism that is often felt, let's say, in a small French town, if some artist or poet is living there. Don't feel any of that except the political stuff during the war. Never felt anything, any kind of hostility coming from anyone. And there's a wonderful thing about living in a community. There was a book by Slater talking about the difference between a network and a community. And a community is different than a network in that a community has idiots and morons and old people and all those things in it. And so that's one good thing about living in or near a small town as opposed to a university, is that you really feel how wide everyone's interest really is. I mean, most people are not that interested in poetry, nor in art, nor in the issue of growth. You get deceived about that if you're in a university, everyone talking about D.H. Lawrence. That's really not the way life goes.
Bly has an interest in the notion that a person needs to feel settled and relaxed, working in touch with the earth. This forms part of an idea he calls grounding.
In other words, when we were speculating on the meaning of the word grounding, there's a possibility that grounding actually does mean grounding, and it takes place best, first of all, in your own country, second of all, in your own state, third of all, in your own county, and fourth of all, right next to where you were born. It's conceivable that there's something in the ground there that's important. And as Americans, we don't have that experience often. In fact, you can say that after the Americans, Norwegians left Norway, then the whole culture is ungrounded for 2 to 3 generations. And what we are living in is a culture totally without ground.
Bring on the hay!
For the simple reason that we left the places where we were grounded. Okay. That's good. I guess we'll just... I don't know, maybe I should take the tractor out of here. Come to pull a pin, you might get Mr. out
This notion of grounding brings together almost everything Bly believes in: his feelings, his family, his farm, and his dreams, which are very real for him and strongly feed his poems. All these things come together then in his work, in an almost surreal mixture of images, visions, feelings, and language. Another way to ground oneself, Bly believes, is through hard work. He gets up at 5:30 nearly every day to read and write. His discipline has had its result in the size of his achievement in writing. This includes, as well as 6 collections of his own poems, the founding of his own press, the Minnesota Writers Publishing House, the publishing of a magazine, and putting out a series of books, essays, and translations. The 15th century Indian ecstatic poet Kabir, Scandinavians such as Thomas Tranströmer, Ralph Jacobson, and Harry Martinson, Germans such as Rainer Maria Rilke and George Trakl, Spanish poets such as Garcia Lorca, Miguel Hernandez, Juan Ramon Jimenez, Vicente Alejandre, and of course Pablo Neruda, the great poet of Chile, for whom Bly shows almost a son's affection for a father. Neruda fought hard to keep the right wing from taking over in Chile, not only with his poetry, but by running for office.
Anyway, so he agreed, and he ran for senator, and he was senator 6 years. And he says the most boring years of his life. He just couldn't believe what it's like to listen to those speeches all day. Anyway, so here he
Neruda moved, as does Bly, between the world of imagination and the world of politics, where he was a fierce critic of repression both at home and abroad. A week after the overthrow of the Allende government in Chile in 1973, Pablo Neruda was dead.
No one lays flowers on the grave of water, for it is not here, it is gone. No one lays flowers on the grave of water, for it is not here, it is gone. I felt that about Neruda. He was just gone. There was a man that died in Madison recently, too, and everyone had the sensation at his funeral that he was gone. There was nothing in the body. And this man had prepared for his death. He'd had a heart attack maybe 3 months before, and he had prepared for it, and he'd prepared for it. He prepared so well that I suppose an hour after he was dead, he was gone. And apparently if you don't prepare for your death, you hang around up to 3 months. Snowmobile types hang around a full 3 months. Whereas they say a saint is gone within 5 minutes after his death. So I think a lot of the poet's work involves reading, which means trying to make yourself familiar with the terrific advances that have been made in the last 2 centuries in science as well as in psychology and in biology and in archaeology. And if the poet doesn't do that, if he just says, well, I just sing my little song, and I just go out and I see a bird and I write about the bird, and that's my job, and don't ask me to do anything more. And in a way, the collective wants the poet to do that. And if he agrees to that, then the poetry may cheer people up, but it isn't really useful to them. Walking north toward the point, I come on a dead seal. From a few feet away, he looks like a brown log. He's lying on his back, dead only a few hours. I stand and look at him. There's a quiver in the dead flesh. My God, he's still alive. And a shock goes through me, as if a wall of my room had fallen away. He's lying on his back. The small whiskers are arched. The whiskers sometimes rise and fall. He's dying. This is the oil. Here on its back is the oil that heats our houses so efficiently. Wind blows.
Through his work with poetry from around the world, Bly feels that some of the elements of good poetry are these.
Like an unfinished arm.
A good poem uses common speech, presents an image of something, and describes real objects, things we see around us in our everyday lives. It should also be powerful in its sound.
So I reach out and touch him. Suddenly he rears up, turns over, gives 3 cries, like the cries from Christmas toys, and he lunges toward me. I'm terrified and leap back.
And finally, a good poem should reveal characters and tell a good story, like Bly's folk poem about a dying seal he found on a beach in California after an oil spill.
And he looks like an old lady who has lost her hair. He puts his chin back down on the sand, rearranges his flippers, and waits for me to go. I go. So the next day I come back to say goodbye. He's dead now, but he's not. He's a quarter mile farther up the shore. Today he's thinner, squatting on his stomach with the head out, and the ribs show more. Each vertebrae on the back underneath the coat is visible, shiny, and he breathes in and out. And a wave comes in, touches his nose, He turns and looks at me. The forehead slanted, the crown of his head looks like a boy's leather jacket bending over some bicycle bars. He's taking a long time to die. The whiskers, white as porcupine quills, the forehead slopes. Goodbye, brother. Die in the sound of waves. Forgive us if we have killed you. Long live your race, your inner tube race, so uncomfortable on land, so comfortable in the ocean. Be comfortable in death then, when the sand will be out of your nostrils and you can swim in long loops through the pure death, ducking under as assassinations break above you. You don't want to be touched by me. I climb the cliff and go home the other way. You can say that a poem has connections going far back into time, like into biology, into images that we have lived for 3 million years so deeply that when a poem brings in one of those images, everyone is touched somewhere inside. So from that point of view, imagination, it isn't true that the poet has imagination as such. That by solitude and other ways, someone who writes poetry opens himself to the inflowing of these images 2 and 3 million years old. And they come in and fill up the poem. So it's a matter of in a way, a poem is a kind of a tide pool in which you lower the threshold a little bit so that the ocean water begins to come in. And once the ocean water comes in, then all kinds of little sea animals who naturally live in the tide pool live there. And the opposite of that would be somehow the rationalism of the 18th century, in which they aren't interested in the ocean. They're interested only in the human intelligence or the human reason. Now, all right, I'll give you one more now. This is a poem by Kabir. I translated this one, and it comes out of the old Indian tradition that many times you expect to find God in the Washington Cathedral, but he isn't there. And in India, they have the image always, someday you're going to walk along the street, you're going to see an old beggar. And you're going to say, get out of the way. And that'll be the one time you met God in your life. Too bad. Maybe you'll have it in a chance again, next life. Indians use that seriously as a metaphor. So I was going to translate it, which means you have to try to bring it into our world. Just putting beggar doesn't do it. I tried beggars nothing. We don't have any beggars, really. So I tried various ways. What is the one person that's the most invisible in our culture, like the beggar? And is, what is that like? And so somebody said, how about a hitchhiker? I tried a hitchhiker, but you know, they're all going somewhere. Like Jack Kerouac used to pick up money from his mother at the post office when he got to the next town. So hitchhikers really aren't poor in this country. And then, yeah, that's true. And he didn't put that in on the road, but that was true. And another possibility is a welfare mother. That didn't work either. I don't know why that didn't work. So finally, I thought about it a couple of months, and I decided what I had mentioned here earlier, that the most invisible people in our culture are probably the old people living up there around Grant and so on, and there's little hotels where 50 to 60 of them live there, you know, and sometimes an old person will die in a hotel room and no one will find them for 2 or 3 days. And actually, they don't dare to go to the doctor because their things are wiped out and their savings are wiped out, so they wait till the last minute and they wait too late. And the Holy One, disguised as an old person in a cheap hotel, goes out to ask for car fare. But I never seem to catch sight of him. And if I did, what would I ask him for? He already knows what is missing in my life. Kabir says, I belong to this old person. Now, let the events about to come. Strange, that's a 15th century Hindu poet, Kabir. I'll read it again. Strange at the end, that energy. Now let the events about to come come. The Holy One, disguised as an old person in a cheap hotel, goes out to ask for car fare. But I never seemed to catch sight of him. And if I did, what would I ask him for? He already knows what's missing in my life. Kabir says, I belong to this old person. Now, let the events about to come come. I don't have much the feeling that isn't it too bad that people in the steel mills don't read poetry? I think you have to respect everyone's life movement, and in the United States now, there is an extremely intense readership for poetry. And those are the ones who have felt that it's the time in their life in which they need poetry. So they come towards the poem out of need. And some of them, they aren't receiving the kind of spiritual instruction that they want from the churches, and so they may come to poetry. Or they need to get in touch with their senses again, so they come to poetry. Or they find more feeling in the poem, and they get in touch with their feelings more than they do from a sermon or from a television show or something. When you write a poem, I don't think that you really want it broadcast by a helicopter to 10,000 people. But in a way, you leave it along the side of the road. And then someone comes along and they notice a little glow in it, they pick it up and take it with them. And so as soon as poetry then, if poetry comes to the point at which it's understood or liked by everyone, say in a steel mill, the chances are that its intensity will already have been gone. It will then have been invaded by the collective. And we will have lost another art form to the collective. So again, I feel that poetry is in a healthy position in which the collective is not making demands on it. You can write a poem, drop it by the side of the road, go home. I put a lot of stock in the old. You know, they have enough with their own, and they hardly see us. They are like fishermen along big rivers. I put a lot of stock in fishermen along big rivers and old people. They have a look in their eyes that you hardly see anymore, the old, as if they were just recovering from a big fever. The old who so gradually become themselves once more, and so gradually break up like smoke. No one notices it. They are gone into sleep and light. They have a look in their eyes that you seldom see anymore, the old. As if they were just recovering from a big fever. The old who so gradually become themselves once more. And so gradually break up like smoke. No one notices it. They are gone into sleep and light. And I started to feel it when I was looking at you.
So did I.
Did you?
Yes.